The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Our aim is to explore the fringe, lost civilizations, alternative science, the paranormal, and much more. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live or future guests via email or the live chat room. And remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And I am your host, Soraya. And this week on Where Did the Road Go, we have with us Mr. Nick Redfern. Are you with us, Nick?
Hey, Soraya. Yeah, I am.
All right. And you not only have a new book out, but you have an article in another new book. So your new book is Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. That is your latest, right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Okay. And you have an article in a book called Lost Secrets of the Gods that has essays from Jim Mars, Robert Schock, yourself, obviously, Micah Hanks, Laird Scranton, and a bunch of other people.
Yeah, the New Page, who published the Lost Secrets of the Gods, they do every so often like a collection of books. Excuse me, they put a book out, I should say, which is like a collection of papers from different people. They did one on UFOs, one on ghosts, and one on ancient mysteries, and now this is another one on ancient mysteries as well, which I think is probably the most popular area right now. And mine deals with sightings of strange creatures in the vicinity of like ancient burial mounds and stone circles, and that's sort of the basic thrust of it, and then sort of digging into theories as to why these creatures might be seen in locations like that.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I last week talked to Lyle Blackburn, and Lyle's very convinced that these creatures are all very flesh and blood. He's never had anyone give him paranormal experiences with them, but you've recounted mostly paranormal experiences with these creatures.
Yeah, actually, Lyle's a good friend of mine. He only lives about 20 minutes away, and so we hang out quite a bit. But yeah, we kind of have like not a difference of opinion, that's the wrong term, but we kind of look at things from different perspectives. And I think what generally happens is that if you sort of focus on sort of the solely flesh and blood side, then people who file reports that fall into that category probably tend to focus on a researcher like that, whereas I guess I'm sort of more known for looking into the weirder side of things like Bigfoot and more paranormal type creatures such as werewolves and things where, there's some reports where these creatures sort of vanish in a flash of light or whatever. So I think when somebody has a stranger type report, I think they typically sort of do a lot of research before they decide who to tell the story to. But I don't believe they're all sort of paranormal creatures. I think some of them, like Orang Pendek, for example, in Sumatra, I think that is like a legitimate unknown type of primitive humanoid, which probably we will get proof of its existence soon. I'm pretty sure of that. But others, like where you get Bigfoot in Britain, where that clearly could not exist, but people see them, that's what sort of leads me down more of this paranormal pathway, if you like.
And could it also be that the paranormal is mimicking something that's really out there?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good theory, the idea that this phenomenon, whatever it is, these intelligences, can actually either manipulate their appearance or manipulate the way we perceive them. In other words, possibly we're dealing with like some sort of single intelligence, and that it sort of picks up on, I guess, like sort of cultural beliefs and archetypal imagery. Maybe that's why, people today see like the Greys in ufology, and 50 years ago they saw the long-haired space brothers, and 500 years ago it was goblins or, things like that, and 2,000 years ago it was demons. Maybe all of these things are kind of interconnected, and I said based on sort of cultural beliefs and what's popular at the time and what's, sort of spinning around in the human subconscious, perhaps they sort of pick up on that and they project some form of imagery that is sort of relevant to the people of the era.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense to me when you look at all these different reports, and especially with the UFO thing. I mean, they've changed so much with our perception to what we think these things are that it's hard to say that they're just nuts and bolts creatures coming down here, because there would be so many of them. But even with the monster accounts, there'd be so many different monsters out there. It's almost ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's only really one thing, well, actually, no, two things that lead me down the path that things like Bigfoot are paranormal. One is that although sort of most researchers do focus on sort of the flesh and blood angle only, the fact is there's probably not at all, but hardly a researcher out there who hasn't at least got a handful of reports that are really, really weird, where the creature sort of vanished in a flash of light, or it's faded away, or it's been able to affect the person's nervous system, where they've kind of felt sick and dizzy and they fell to the ground, or the creature, the footprints of it just sort of come to a complete halt in the snow or the mud, as if it's vanished. So, there's probably hardly a researcher who doesn't have at least one or half a dozen or more of those reports. The problem is a lot of researchers won't deal with them. And the other issue I have is that, particularly in the United States, the idea that entire colonies of sort of 7 to 8 foot tall apes could successfully elude us 100% of the time with a 100% success rate. Now, I would be willing to accept, if we didn't have those sort of rogue cases, I would be willing to accept it was just flesh and blood, if it was just, say, really in the deep Pacific Northwest forests up to Canada and places like that. But, I live just outside Dallas, about 20 minutes from where Kennedy was shot. I can actually drive no more than 45 minutes from here and be in an area where people claim to have seen literally 8 to 9 feet tall Bigfoot, now, or Bigfoots, whatever you want to term them. So in that sense, when we're unable to catch, kill, capture, get conclusive evidence of giant apes only 45 minutes from where President Kennedy was shot in '63, to me there's something wrong. Nothing should be of that sheer scale and size should be that elusive, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think, again, comparing it to the UFO phenomena, I think it's something that we're not going to fully understand till we understand consciousness and how it interacts with reality a little better.
No, you're right, and I mean, that's a very good point, because when we look at things throughout the centuries, although the creatures change, if you like, very often the sort of the motif of what actually happens doesn't change. For example, you can look today at the so-called greys in ufology, where when people are abducted, they often see imagery of the collapse of the ecosystem and the atmosphere and the polar ice caps, as if the greys are trying to warn us. Well, back in the 50s, it was the long-haired space brothers warning us about nuclear destruction, atomic bombs and so on. Yeah. You can go right back to sort of biblical times, sort of Moses going up Mount Sinai, and there was this sort of dark cloud, as it was described, and then God gives him the tablets telling us how to live. Well, the voice of God coming out of a dark cloud telling us how to live actually isn't that much different from somebody encountering a flying saucer and being told by the space brothers how to live and don't fight, or being kidnapped by the greys and being shown imagery of the end of the world. Or, if you don't change your ways, this is what will happen. It's very much, and although it gets into controversial areas when you start sort of challenging or questioning religious beliefs, which are held closely by a lot of people. But, I think when we look at these stories, I mean, like Joseph Smith, getting the plates and so on, that's like a classic contactee case of the 50s. And I think all these things are somehow interconnected. Whether they're extraterrestrial, whether they're interdimensional, whether it's something we just don't understand, I'm not sure. But I am sure that whatever's going on, it's the same thing throughout history, but presenting itself in a fashion that is acceptable to the people of that era. In other words, it's almost like a sophisticated hologram, if you like, projected into our minds or projected in front of us. And maybe we've never really seen the intelligence as it really exists,
Right. Maybe we can't see it as it really exists.
Yeah, maybe it actually has no real form. I mean, if you look back at, for example, in sort of Middle Eastern tales of the jinn, which today, we equate them with the genie, this sort of hot little woman in a bottle, But that's actually like a modern-day distortion. The jinn, from which the term genie is taken, were sort of highly malevolent, dangerous entities that lived in like a different realm to us, but they were pure energy. In that sense, you couldn't see them, but they could make themselves known in certain forms, like, for example, large black dogs. And interestingly enough, black dogs are a staple part of paranormal activity today. So in other words, the jinn, when you look at those ancient stories, it actually sounds like some sort of pure energy entity inhabiting some other realm that could occasionally cross paths with ours, and they would manipulate us and use us and so on. And but if they were pure energy, we couldn't see them. Maybe that's why at times they would manifest into a physical form, purely so they could be seen.
Or maybe they're not even picking the form. Maybe our brain just picks up that energy and just wraps a form around it because it doesn't know what else to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good point as well. I think that it's sort of probably like a to and fro, back and forth, where you have a phenomenon which is interacting with us and we're interacting with it, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And it picks up on sort of cultural beliefs that are in our minds, in our subconscious at the time, and we kind of expand on that, and it sort of all comes together, the two together. It's kind of like if you asked anybody, like even a kid over the age of 5 upwards, to draw an alien face, they would draw a big round head with 2 black eyes, because everybody knows that's what aliens are supposed to look like. But if you did that 50 years ago, they probably would have drawn like the typical blondes, the Space Brothers, or some hot space woman from like some 1950s sci-fi movie, because that was the image back then, and so I think for that reason that there is very much this situation of the two coming together, so to speak. Now, when it comes to things like Bigfoot and strange creatures, I'm not entirely sure that they fall into exactly the same category. I tend to think that Bigfoot does have a physical aspect to it, but I also think that it's sort of like a temporary residence, if you like, in our environment or our dimension. I think it has the ability to sort of flit in and out of our reality. And I think, so in other words, it may well be flesh and blood or have flesh and blood components, but the reason why we're not able to catch something that's 8 feet tall, which we clearly should be able to, is because it's simply not here all the time, and it should be, if it's just a flesh and blood animal.
Right, and I think there are people who would hear you say that and be like, well, that's a crazy idea, but at the same time, there are too many reliable Bigfoot accounts to dismiss them. And like you said, we should have found them by now. So there has to be another answer that's outside of the box.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt they exist, because you're right, people see them. People have seen them for centuries, before the term Bigfoot was coined. I mean, that wasn't coined until like the late 50s. But you can go back and find old newspaper reports from the 19th century where people would see what were called wild men, hairy wild men in the woods. There are actually stories not long after the settlers came over from Europe, talking about sort of hairy giants in the mountains. So in other words, they've always been around us, but I kind of view them more as like I won't say magical, because that sounds too simplistic, but kind of almost like a nature spirit or something like that. But
and isn't that how Native Americans kind of look at them?
Oh yeah, they have a belief in the creatures, but they also believe they're sort of somehow linked in with nature and the environment, and they have this sort of magical component to them where they can literally sort of flit in and out of our reality into whatever another reality may be, however we term them, like portals, doorways, gateways, dimensions, who knows. But I think when you look at a lot of these Bigfoot cases, what you get, it's like there's a wave. It goes on for a few weeks in one area, then it suddenly ends, and then it pops up again 3 months later somewhere else. And it literally does seem not that they've just moved on to a new place, but they've gone, and then they suddenly come back again somewhere else. You know, it's not like they've migrated. It's literally just the start of a new wave and a new wave and a new wave.
Yeah, kind of like UFO encounters.
Yeah, exactly.
So another weird aspect of all of this type of stuff is the fact that these things come in waves, and I mean, maybe it has something to do with solar activity or effects on our brain. I know Robert Schoch wrote the one book on psychic ability, showing that when solar activity was higher, so was psychic ability.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I happen to think it's a controversial theory, and of course it requires proof to prove it. But one of the things that interests me is the idea that all these creatures and all these entities are seen because they need to be seen, and that kind of ties in with the idea. One theory that's been put forward is that these entities sort of, whereas we live on food and liquid, they live on they're literal energy entities, and so they need energy to live. And so, in other words, what they do is to instill high states of excitement or fear in the witness, and then they sort of bleed that energy dry. So in that sense, we're almost like a food source, as kind of ominous as it sounds. You know, the idea that, for example, you get that a lot in the Men in Black reports, where people feel like the Men in Black are sort of draining them dry of energy. Now, if you think about it, the main thrust in all the Men in Black reports is that they frighten and threaten and terrorize and warn the witnesses not to talk about things. But they never follow through with any sort of, you know, they never kill anybody. There aren't really hardly any reports of the Men in Black literally killing people. But, you know, they instill massive fear in the people. Now, people have said, other researchers have said, well, why is it they just sometimes turn up in the most down-to-earth routine cases, like lights in the sky cases, because it isn't always prominent cases. So maybe this silencing is just a ruse. Maybe the whole point is to create fear, which they can then feed on, but they need a cover story to fall back on, so we don't understand what the real purpose is, and that's to silence us about the UFO encounter. Maybe they could actually not care less about whether we talk about it or not. The main thing they want to do is frighten us, and then they can feed on that energy, if you like.
And you could say the same thing about the black-eyed children encounters, which seem that's their prime thing.
Yeah, you're right. The primary motive in a lot of these sort of more supernatural ones, like the Men in Black, the black-eyed children, the shadow people, it always seems to be that fear is involved, and you know, they go out of their way to be seen. They knock on people's doors. It's also the same with a lot of UFO cases. You go back to the 50s, where you had a lot of reports where people would be driving down roads, and they claim to have seen like a landed UFO, not a big one, just a smallish one with these small creatures around it, collecting soil samples and so on. And it's almost like the event is staged for the person. It wasn't like they kind of stumbled on it by mistake. It literally was that, you know, it was done for their purpose, so to speak. And maybe, again, that was to, you know, to feed on them. I mean, Charles Fort, you know, who's responsible for coining the term like 14 Times magazine, that kind of thing. Charles Fort, you know, made a famous statement that he said that he thinks we were property, or we are property. And, you know, maybe that's how somebody else views us. Yeah. We literally are somebody's energy-based food source, possibly.
How would that relate into some of the more positive encounters, though?
Well, again, I mean, you could look at it from different perspectives. One perspective would be the angle that you have different types of entities dealing with us, you know, and some entities are negative and some are positive. You know, I don't think it's as black and white as that. It's kind of like saying people are good and evil. You know, it doesn't kind of work that well. You know, it's we're all capable of evil. We're all capable of good. Excuse me. And I think it could be the same, that different entities have different themes and ideas, but there are certain ones that, you know, clearly seem just downright evil, like the shadow people, the Hat Man. You know, the jinn being highly manipulative and, you know, plunging people's lives into chaos or whatever. And but I think also when you have positive reports, I mean, you don't find really that there's any deceit involved where it sort of backfires at a later point. You know, it just often really does just elevate people's lives, and there's no negative things. So, you know, maybe some of these ancient legends and stories of, you know, good versus evil, angels versus demons, maybe they're all kind of based out of the fact that ancient man knew that there were, you know, sort of positive and negative entities out there and knew which ones to sort of mix with and which ones to avoid. But I think over time they've become sort of mutated into literal stories of winged demons and winged angels and horned demons and, you know, whatever. But I don't think that doesn't mean there aren't positive and negative entities. I think that there are. It's just, you know, culture and belief systems and different religions have put different spins on what they're supposed to look like, etc.
What do you think? How do you think this relates into like ghost phenomena? Do you think it's part of the same thing, or are we looking at something else when people have these ghost encounters?
Well, I actually think ghost encounters fall into a number of different categories. I think there's clear enough evidence to me that some of these things don't seem self-aware. It's almost like an old video loop playing over and over again, where you have, you know, the same ghost scene at the same place at the same time, and repeating exactly the same actions. I'm kind of less inclined to think that they're, you know, some sort of spirit, in the sense that, you know, why are they just doing the same thing over and over again? Now, other ones, I think it's harder to explain, where, you know, you have reports of when there's been a violent death, and some researchers think that, you know, the spirit has got trapped or something like this in a, you know, when it's like a specific turmoil, and it's a tragedy or a murder or something. It's like something stays behind, some residual part of the person's consciousness, you know, always stays there. Then I think there are other examples where, for example, you have entities which could be evil entities that masquerade as, you know, dead family members and this sort of thing. And this is why I always tell people to be extremely careful where you kind of dig into things like Ouija boards, where, you know, I actually think that concentrating in the mind and believing you can achieve this can actually open doorways, and you can let things through. And if these things are sort of really deceptive, evil and manipulative, you may actually open the door to something that you think is, you know, a dead friend or a relative, and it's actually your worst nightmare, you know. So I think some of them are self-aware, some of them are very cunning and evil, others could be like a video loop, and some may legitimately be a kind of something coming back. You know, I don't write that much about ghosts, hardly ever, in fact, not because it doesn't sort of, aspects of it don't interest me. Certain aspects of it do. But, you know, there's so many people who've been in this field, or that field I should say, for so long, that, you know, there's no point me sort of stumbling around. But what I would say is that back in 2003, the dog I had at the time, she was a Shar-Pei, she died. And right afterwards, I mean, there were some genuinely weird things that happened, like a sudden, I mean, I can still remember this to this day, a sudden overwhelming smell of wet dog, you know, in the apartment. Excuse me, well, actually in the garage, but I mean, as you went through from the apartment, you know, it just hit you. And sort of hearing nails, you know, like toenails on the corridor floor, on the tiles. And, you know, I don't care what anybody says, neither of those things were my imagination or, you know, anything like that. That happened. And so, you know, I actually do believe something survives bodily death. I really do believe that. But I'm not someone who ties into the rigid thing that, you know, there's this place where you go upwards and it's full of clouds and harps, and if you go down below, it's fiery pits and demons with horns, and this guy, you know, prodding you with a forked tail, whatever, you know. I think those scenarios are really more designed to keep people controlled through fear and guilt. But that doesn't take away the fact that I really do believe there is life after death, and I think I think whatever survives bodily death kind of may for a while temporarily stay around in this environment, but then moves on to what we might call, like in simple terms, another dimension, but one that we cannot access physically, but, the life essence, life force, the soul, whatever you want to call it. Maybe that makes maybe part of the physical process of being alive and dying is that this intelligence, this residual energy, whatever it is, automatically sort of, makes a transition to whatever this other realm is,
Yeah. And I think, again, it comes down to how little we really know about reality and consciousness. Science just dismisses it as just a artifact of material things. But when you look at a lot of this phenomena, we're clearly missing something huge.
Well, we are. I mean, the one thing I would say that, to me, demonstrates we're not seeing the full picture of what reality is the issue of synchronicities. Now,
Yeah.
I get a lot of synchronicities, and I think the more you dig into the world of the paranormal, the more synchronicities you get as well. And it's like as if something is trying to teach you something, but sometimes it's also a bit manipulative and sometimes almost tricksterish, where you feel something's just playing with you for the fun of it, some warped reason. But other times it's for positive reasons, and I never dismiss synchronicities, and I always try and figure out what they mean, what they imply, and so on. So, I've had a lot of very positive experiences by listening to the synchronicity and trying to figure out what it means. But when you kind of can be thinking of something, and then you have such a weird synchronicity, like finding a book on a shelf in a bookstore that you've been looking for weeks, and then you suddenly think of it, and you happen to go in a short store you've never been before, and you see it. Tons of people have had things like that happen.
Yep.
And so clearly then there's got to be something about reality we're not understanding. And I admit I don't understand it, but it happens, so there's definitely something's taking place.
I had written a piece recently where I thought about the idea that maybe this is kind of like a video game, but we have our own free will in the video game, and our higher self sits outside the video game and just kind of like tries to push us in the right direction. And when we're paying attention, that's when we get the synchronicities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But, our higher self can't like just take control and get us to do things. It can just suggest. And some people are better at it than others.
No, you're right. And I think also there may be sort of a bit of a quality to it, like in The Matrix or Dark City, both movies which are actually quite similar to each other, where, the idea that we're sort of in a world that we think what we see around us is the real world, but there may be more to it or less to it, and, how much of it is sort of an instilled dream or hologram even, or, is it a bit of all that? I don't know, but I definitely think that reality as we perceive it isn't reality as it actually is.
Yeah, and we can only see what our senses allow us to see on top of that.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, because, we see what we see. You take an animal like a bat. All the people say bats have radar. They don't actually have radar, but they do have senses that allow them to sort of bounce back imagery and solid objects, so they can see where they're going in pretty much complete darkness. They do have, in simple terms, what we might call like a form of radar. Then you've got things like electric eels, which can electrocute their prey in the water. If we would do that, that'd be like saying you've got superpowers or something, you know what I mean? But it's not. But eels have that, electric eels have that ability.
Yeah.
Look at something as small as a spider. There's no way we could ever spin a web like a spider. You could give a human being 20 reels of cotton, and never in a million years would they be able to build something as fantastic as a spider's web, So there are sort of skills and talents that are explainable by science that are far beyond and far elude people. As I said, things like electrocution, the natural ability to electrocute somebody or something, or to certain animals like pigeons, homing pigeons.
Yeah.
They're the most popular theory is they actually follow magnetic waves and lines. And that must be sort of theories have been made that they can actually potentially even see these magnetic lines, sort of looking at a map, you know, an old style map with looking at the roads and whatever. But they may actually be able to travel because of that specific reason. So lots of stuff that even on Earth, you know, animals that coexist with us that have skills and talents that and senses that go far beyond ours. So something from somewhere else that is majorly ahead of us, we wouldn't really understand it, have a chance of understanding what it does at all, I think.
True. All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be back in about 45 seconds with Nick Redfern.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And tonight we've been talking with Mr. Nick Redfern. And Nick, your latest book, to change the subject a little here, because I definitely want to get into this, is called Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. And when did this come out?
This came out at the end of June, so it's been out about 7 weeks, something like that, just around about 2 months. And it's basically a study of literally dozens of unusual, mysterious, suspicious deaths within the field of ufology. Everything from military pilots, civilian pilots, researchers, authors, investigators, people who've had close encounters, where they've died under odd circumstances, where in some cases the person has literally vanished, or the plane has crashed and they've died in the crash, or they've suffered suspicious heart attacks, or where it appears they've committed suicide, but where the suicide may not be that after all.
And what number book is this for you? Do you know?
Do I know? I think it's at 28, something like that, 29. I know I'm coming up to around about the 30 mark. So.
Nice. And every time I read one of your books, like sometimes you'll deal with stuff that I'm familiar with, but you'll find other stuff that I didn't know about it, or you'll have a different twist on it that I wasn't familiar with. And
well,
go on.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that, I mean, to a degree, you know, we are limited in how much we can actually talk about in the UFO subject that hasn't been spoken about before. But rather than just go over old ground, yeah, I do, you know, I don't do it deliberately just to, oh, well, I'm going to find a new angle. If I've got a new angle on something, then I'll put it out for people to see. But I do think it's important, if you're going to, you know, deal with a case that's known, well, don't just, you know, take 50 words from this person's book and 75 from that person's book, or 100 words from this article. You know, go back and see if there is anything new we can add to it, because the surprising thing is that very often there actually is something you can add to it, and often quite a lot that's perhaps been overlooked, or somebody's just written it off as nonsense, and everybody else has just followed then what that person said, rather than actually going back and looking at the full story.
Yeah, and the thing that I find the most disturbing about this is how so much of this, although it has connections to UFOs, seems to have maybe more responsibility lent toward the government than the actual UFO phenomena.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things I've mentioned in the book, and what I've sort of stressed in all the sort of interviews I've done for the book, is that I actually don't think any of these deaths per se are due to what we would call, quote, the government. What I personally think is that the entire sort of, the real deep and dark secrets and, you know, everything as it relates to UFOs, it goes beyond, you know, like Project Blue Book and things like this, but the real sort of keepers of the secret, I actually think it's some sort of like a shadow government that exists outside of the regular elected government. And I think that, you know, 99.9% of everybody in, whether it's the CIA, the Pentagon, the Air Force, the government, they know nothing about this agency. You know, if we go back and we look at, say, the 40s onwards, it's clear that the military and the intelligence community was at the forefront of investigating these things and, keeping under wraps what was known back then. But, and clearly we have a fairly good body of evidence to suggest that presidents like Truman and Eisenhower were fully informed. But after that, you get these rumors of presidents having to ask questions, and nobody seems to know who knows what's going on. And I think at some point, sort of 60s, 70s, all of the, whether craft, bodies, wreckage, technology, all the documents, autopsy reports, whatever, I think it was all handed over to some sort of, like a shadow agency that operates outside of government, that probably gets its funding through black budget means and so on. So I actually don't think the government per se, as we would call it, are the bad guys. I really do think today's government is out of the loop. And that sounds bizarre, and because of the concept of we expect the Pentagon or the CIA to know, but I think they really don't. Maybe one or two really high up ones do, but I think the rest of the people don't. And I think, if you can wrap your head around that concept of a shadow agency, possibly kind of tied in with some ancient powerful order like the Illuminati, something like that, and then put them together, sort of old money, big powerful people, major corporations that perhaps do contract work for government agencies, but they're outside the loop. I think that's where all the evidence has been turned over to. And I think when somebody gets too close to the truth, those are the sorts of private corporations that can just hire someone to, make somebody go away, so to speak.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about, there's a group called the Octopus that someone was researching. You want to tell people a little about that?
Well, yeah, the Octopus is a really weird story. It goes back to, actually the 80s, but came to its sort of pinnacle in the 1990s. There was this guy named Danny Casolaro who was an investigative journalist, and he was hot on the trail of this group that he called the Octopus. And again, it was like some sort of shadow powerful agency with worldwide strands and ties that pretty much just operated outside of governments, but was so powerful it was able to manipulate government and manipulate military agencies and arms corporations, and had people inside the military and inside the intelligence community sort of manipulating things without their knowledge. Almost like you'd have like a cabal trying to take over the government almost, without literally taking it over, but just keeping on manipulating things the way they wanted it done. And he was writing a book called The Octopus, but that all came to a crashing halt in 1991 when Casolaro was found dead in a hotel room in West Virginia. And the circumstances surrounding his death, with slash marks on his wrists, there were a lot of suspicions that it was sort of like a staged suicide. Well, not long after that, two other researchers, Ken Thomas and Jim Keith, they decided to write a book all about Danny Casolaro's research into the octopus, and the book he was going to write essentially. Well, it turns out then in 1999, Jim Keith, the co-author, he died, and he died under very odd circumstances. It was what happened was that he attended quite regularly the Burning Man festival in Nevada, which sort of takes its inspiration from the old Wicker Man celebrations in Celtic times in Europe, where like a huge wooden effigy of a man would be created and be loaded with chickens and pigs and goats and set on fire, just as a means to sort of appease the earth gods, the nature gods, to get a bountiful, food supply next year, etc. And so, in other words, human sacrifice was at the heart of it. It just so happens, as I said, that Jim Keith was at the Burning Man Festival, 99. He fell off the stage and fractured his tibia. Now, the next day he was in such pain, he had to call an ambulance to take him to hospital. His nephew came to the hospital, and Jim Keith actually said to him, he said, "I know if they put me under, I'm not going to wake up." And because he'd fractured his tibia, he did have to be, fully anesthetized. And that's exactly what happened. He didn't wake up. He died from a blood clot on his lungs. The official story was it traveled from his knee to his lungs and killed him. What's really weird is that at the time of his death, Jim Keith was actually researching like this concoction that somebody, like an octopus-type group, had created, which could be injected into under the skin, and it would cause your blood to clot, create massive clots, and specifically in the lungs to mimic, just somebody who unfortunately died of a blood clot in the lungs. So he actually died of the very thing he was writing about and researching and suggesting was tied into the octopus even. So that's really strange. And then 2 years after, his publisher, Ron Bonds died of food poisoning. Now people say, well, it was just an unlucky situation. Ron Bonds died of food poisoning. What was interesting is that the particular strain of bacteria he died from was Clostridium, and it turns out that also at the time of his death, Jim Keith was heavily researching the cattle mutilation phenomenon and found that in many of the mutilated cattle, they had higher levels of Clostridium. So, that's sort of a weird thing as well. And everything about sort of the octopus and Jim Keith and Ron Barnes and Danny Castellaro, it's all sort of, it's conspiratorial, but it almost has like paranormal overtones, with it all sort of having Jim Keith fall off the stage at a festival where the whole impetus is on like human sacrifice. It's very, very odd.
Yeah, that was definitely a weird case. The other one that's really disturbing is the whole Marconi death situation.
Oh yeah, that's very odd. Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up, in England. I remember the whole Marconi thing when it took off. But for people who aren't aware of it, from the early 80s to the early 90s, no less than 31 scientists, technicians, computer programmers, experts in radar, lasers, etc., all died in the UK under very weird circumstances. And when it comes to like 31 of them, either working for this company called Marconi or contracted to them, then clearly something weird's going on. But this all ties in the early 80s when President Reagan came up with this idea of what unofficially became known as Star Wars, but was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. And the idea was to have like an orbiting armada, if you like, of laser-based weapons that if the Russians or the Chinese launched a sneak attack, this huge array of laser-based weapons in space could sort of pick off the missiles one by one, and hopefully none of them would ever reach their target. They'd just be vaporized in the sky. Well, the idea was great. The technology wasn't as advanced as it was hoped to be. And one of the companies that was brought in to do contract work on SDI was this British company, Marconi. And they had a lot of sort of groundbreaking and leading experts in the field of lasers, radar, aviation, aerospace technology, rocket technology, things like this. So in other words, they were the ideal company to get on board. And a lot of the Marconi people, as I said, did work on the SDI program. Now, when everything kicked off with Marconi, this is when we saw all these weird deaths occurring. Now, as I said, it was literally like 31. People were jumping off bridges. They were crossing the highway in the vehicle at like 80 mile an hour and slamming into empty restaurants. That's what one of the guys did. They were electrocuting themselves in bizarre fashion. There was 5 or 6 who just came home from work, put the car in the garage, left the engine on, and killed themselves with carbon monoxide poisoning. Others just vanished. There was actually one extremely weird case where the guy actually didn't die, but what happened was that he turned up in France 2 months later with his mind kind of scrambled, unable to figure out how he got there, why he was there, or anything at all. And this was a guy named Avtar Singh Gida, and he was working with Marconi on SDI and also with the British Ministry of Defence. And he could not figure out anything about how he got there. And this has sort of given rise to the theory that all these scientists and personnel somehow had their minds scrambled, or it was like some sort of subliminal hypnotic suggestion telling them to kill themselves. That's the weird thing, is that none of the people involved had sort of predispositions to depression or anxiety. They weren't in the middle of going through a divorce or anything like this. It was just like an everyday at work, normal day, but then they killed themselves. And one of the most intriguing theories that I talk about in the book is that there have been long-standing rumors that SDI wasn't just aimed at the Soviets or the Chinese, but Reagan had supposedly been briefed, highly classified briefing, on the idea that there could be hostile extraterrestrials. There were like suspicions that some of the UFO angle was hostile, and the scenario was that Reagan said, well, we could use SDI against the Russians and the Chinese, but maybe we could turn it outwards as well against any hostile forces coming in towards the Earth. Now, if that was the case, if there were hostile aliens and they were sort of concerned that we were developing SDI, well, how would you stop SDI being developed? Maybe you would kill the scientists. And if you're an advanced enough alien species where you could manipulate the human mind, maybe that explains why all these SDI scientists suddenly either killed themselves or jumped off bridges, and et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, it's a controversial scenario, but it's no less controversial than the literal facts that 31 people working for Marconi, many working on the SDI program, just ended their lives in the most bizarre fashions possible.
Yeah, yeah, and it's definitely disturbing. As are a lot of the cases in this book. Like I said, a lot of them seem to have less to do with actual UFOs, but there are cases of UFOs knocking planes out of the sky. One of the things you open up with, which was really disturbing, is the case in South America there, and I'm forgetting the guy's name off the top of my head here, where his Folio.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is sort of very weird story. I mean, I didn't deliberately set out to start with a really grisly story. That's just because I did it chronologically. That's how it happened. But this deals with a 1946 case, a man named João Prestes Filho. He was a farmer, and he lived in a little village in Brazil. And he'd been out fishing all day long and trekked back to his village at night, and kind of had that feeling that we all have at times when you think someone's watching you. You're in the queue at the local store or whatever, and you just turn around, you think someone's watching you, and when you turn around, somebody is, from 60 feet away. We all have that kind of ability to do that if we don't know why. And he had that feeling, Phil had that feeling all the way back home, even when he got back inside his home. And he couldn't shake it off, so he looked out the window and saw this bright light in the sky, which was hovering. Now, it wasn't a helicopter, because this was a little isolated village. There was no sound or nothing, so it clearly wasn't a helicopter. But suddenly, it bathed him in this powerful light, but also like a burning light as well. And he obviously jumped back from the window, but whatever had hit him had sort of already done the damage, and his skin started to lightly peel, at first at least, and then it blistered, and he started to panic and call for help from friends and neighbors, and they raced him to the hospital. Now, by the time he got to the hospital, his skin was actually not just peeling, but, so the outer layer and then the next layer and the next layer of skin was sort of peeling off as well. And a number of the medics who were involved have actually spoken out. It isn't like a friend of a friend story, as some people have assumed. Everybody's spoken out on the record. For example, one of the medics was a man named Horacio Gomide, and he actually went public in 1974 saying that how he was there at the time and saw everything. He said that doctors were basically just forced to look on as the guy's skin just melted off him, and he died in front of them. Now, we'll probably never know exactly what it was that killed him, but it kind of a little bit sounds like microwave technology, in the sense that we all use microwave ovens, and if you cook anything, it says let it stand for like a minute or two afterwards. A lot of people think that's because microwave food is extremely hot, so you want to let it stand because you're going to burn your tongue or whatever. That's actually not the reason. The reason is that microwave energy cooks from the inside out. So in other words, if you eat the food immediately, the microwave is actually still cooking it while you're eating it. That's why they tell you to leave for 2 minutes. And it kind of sounds like something like that with what happened to Filho, that he was hit by some sort of microwave or something similar that cooked him literally from the inside outwards and melted him.
Wow. Yeah, and that's definitely disturbing, and Yeah. um, when you go through this book, you mentioned the Majestic 12 stuff a bunch of times. What is your opinion on that? I mean, I know a lot of people feel it's a fraud and disinformation. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the documents, the name, etc., etc., I think this has been created by whoever's hiding the UFO truth. I think they've circulated these stories and these questionable documents to essentially confuse people and push them down the wrong pathway and, keep them active in an area that keeps them away from the real story. But what I would say, if UFOs have crashed, if alien bodies have been recovered, then I think clearly it would mean that some sort of group like that would have been created. But, the big question is, what would it be? How would it work? Etc., etc. But I think that is the main thing. It sort of sows the seed of confusion when somebody puts fake stories out. And unfortunately, a lot of these fake stories just get believed, they get accepted, and it becomes part of ufology. And the problem is trying to figure out what's real, what's fake, what falls in between the two.
Yeah. What about one of the stories I found very interesting was that of Zygmunt Adamski.
Oh yeah.
And you want to tell people a little about what happened to him and how that connects in?
Yeah, well, Zygmunt Adamski was a guy who died in a little English village called Todmorden in the north of England in 1980. Todmorden kind of looks like a village that's straight out of, one of these Agatha Christie 1930s murder mysteries, which has got like a little village church and the pub and, somebody got murdered in the library. It's like one of those little villages like that. And but Zygmunt Adamski, bear in mind the name Adamski first, and not that common a name. Of course, George Adamski was one of the most famous contactees of all time. Well, Zygmunt Adamski was a Polish man living in the north of England in this village of Todmorden, and he was found dead one day. Literally, his body was found on a coal stack, like a stack of coal, at a coal yard. The staff there clearly hadn't seen him before. Some people suggest he looked like the body had been dropped onto the coal stack. There was actually a burn mark on him, and it looked like he'd been dressed and undressed, and somebody had tied the shoelaces up incorrectly, and the buttons weren't in line with each other where they should be. A lot of odd things about his death anyway. Now, the responding policeman was a man named Alan Godfrey. This was in the summer of 1980. And Alan Godfrey was a police constable in Todmorden. He was the main constable responding to it. And a few months later, as 1980 came to a close, he actually had very much like a contactee type UFO encounter. He was on an early shift, like 5 a.m., and saw this object in the middle of the road. Because it was dark, he couldn't figure out what it was. He thought it was like a bus on its side or just parked oddly in the middle of the road until he got closer. Then he had a period of missing time. Next thing he knew, he was driving along the road and then started to have these weird dreams and nightmares. So he had regressive hypnosis, which revealed that he was taken on board the craft and had, like I said, a classic contactee type encounter with a very human-looking alien. Now, this has sort of all become intertwined with the death of Zygmunt Adamski. You've got the synchronicity of the name Adamski. You've got the fact that the body may have been dropped, the weird burn on it. He was also missing for a couple of days. Somebody clearly seemed to have sort of redressed him. And then the responding police officer gets kidnapped by aliens. So that's a very, very odd story that even today in the UK, it's become like a classic UFO story that everybody in the field knows about, and even Todmorden itself is a strange place. It's sort of a home to an ancient stone circle, and interestingly enough, we were talking about black dogs earlier. Mm-hmm. The entire town has a history of legends of these sort of ghostly black dogs that would come for the souls of the dead, when somebody moves on. So, again, it has like a paranormal quality to it as well.
Now, one of the things in the book, I guess, that also falls into the disturbing category, are the connections to MK Ultra and some of these possible deaths.
Well, yeah, this is quite controversial because although there's no doubt in my mind there's a genuine UFO phenomenon, there's no doubt at all about that.
Yeah.
But I talk about some cases where UFO events may have been fabricated to place people into like altered states of mind, hypnotically affect them, give them sort of subliminal drugs and psychedelics, and then stage UFO events and see if the person falls for it. In other words, it's not so much to fake a UFO event just for the sake of doing it, but it's along the lines of, well, if we can make people see UFOs, we can make them see anything, in other words. And certainly MK Ultra was the most famous of all the varied mind control programs around the world. It still remains the most famous one, which was focused on, as I said, like hypnotic techniques, mind control, mind manipulation, that sort of thing. And I talk about a couple of cases in the book where controversial deaths occurred in the wake of MK Ultra operations. I talk about one in England where a man named Edward Bryant was supposedly, against his knowledge, sort of unwittingly used in one of these MK Ultra type programs where his mind was targeted with microwave technology and subliminal drugs and hypnosis to make him think he'd seen a UFO. And the story is that the microwave technology was used to a dangerous degree. And what happened is that not long after the UFO encounter, he developed an extremely aggressive brain tumor that killed him. And so the theory is that this sort of directed microwave technology to try and create a faked UFO event actually stimulated the growth of the tumor, or caused it to grow at a sort of really fast rate and killed him. So that one wasn't a case of murder. That reportedly was just a case of just reckless use of technology on a member of the public.
And can we say for sure that that's what caused it?
No, we can't. But I mean, the story itself comes from a man named Bosko Nedeljkovic, the story, I should just say, the story of Bryant and his death and his UFO account, that all surfaced in the 1960s. It was published in UFO magazines and journals, and even an entire book was written about it in the 60s. But in 1978, a guy named Bosko Nedeljkovic came forward and approached a UFO researcher named Rich Reynolds, which is still active on the scene to this day. And Nedeljkovic had all sorts of shadowy ties with the world of intelligence and espionage, not just in the US, but all around the world. And he said that he'd read files that talked about the Bryant case and pretty much made it 99.9% clear that the death was an accident due to the overuse of mind-altering technologies, including microwave technology that had stimulated the growth of the tumor. So, and there was no real reason for Nedeljkovic to tell that to Rich Reynolds. It wasn't like he was, going to get anything out of it. And Rich didn't publish the story for a long, long time. So it's a very weird story, but, I stress that even if agencies have fabricated UFO events, it doesn't take away the fact that there's also a genuine phenomenon as well.
Oh, sure. And if they're fabricating it, they're probably fabricating it off the genuine phenomena.
Yes, yeah.
You also say that the Benny and Barney Hill case could possibly be associated to MK Ultra as well.
Well, I mean, this is really weird because John Keel, who wrote The Interrupted Journey, which was arguably sort of the proto-alien abduction book, and dealt with the most famous early abduction case, Betty and Barney Hill from '61. John Fuller was totally sort of plugged into the world of MK Ultra. In the late 50s, there were certain people in the CIA who wanted the story of MK Ultra to be put into the public domain. Some of them were actually concerned as to where the research was going. John Keel was contacted by some of the scientists on board and asked if he would be interested in being the journalist to break the story.
Keel or Fuller?
Excuse me, Fuller, not John Keel. John Fuller. I'm getting my Johns mixed up.
That's all right.
But, John Fuller. And so John Fuller wrote The Interrupted Journey on the Betty and Barney Hill case and was almost sort of brought into the MK Ultra program in the late 50s. Now, on top of that, there's an even weirder angle to all this. In the early 1970s, John Fuller wrote a book on a strange event that occurred in France. And this was an event that occurred in the early 1950s, and it prompted Fuller to write a book called The Day of St. Anthony's Fire. And it dealt with an outbreak of what sounded like some sort of hallucinatory situation in this little French village. And it was all put down to a substance called ergot, which is, when it's placed into food, if it sort of goes past its date, it can actually provoke sort of horrific visions and dreams and all sorts of hallucinations. But it turns out that the particular event itself in this little French village called Pont Saint-Esprit, there's now good evidence that it was some sort of early MK Ultra type program where psychedelic substances or mind-altering technologies were actually released in like an aerosol type fashion over the village to provoke sort of terrible hallucinations in the people. So here's Keel. If I say that before, here's Fuller looking into this whole angle of MK Ultra in the 50s with the CIA, writing a book, The Day of St. Anthony's Fire, about Pont Saint-Esprit, and then, you have him tied in with Betty and Barney Hill, which some people have suggested was it MK Ultra. You have to wonder, did Fuller know more, or is it just some sort of huge, bizarre coincidence?
Yeah. And what isn't the one? I can't remember the name of the two down in the south with the robot that abducted them. I can't remember their name.
Oh yeah, you're talking about the Pascagoula case.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this was an interesting one as well, involving two guys, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. This was October '73. They were fishing on the Pascagoula River when they felt sort of weirded out, sort of a bit spaced out, and suddenly they saw this strange light coming across the river. Next thing they knew, these weird creatures were manhandling them on board a UFO. And the creatures were actually not described like the classic Greys or the Space Brothers. They were more along the lines as if they were wearing something like a complete one-piece diver's suit or something like that almost. Now, again, it's become a classic UFO event. But what's interesting, and what I point out in the book, is that just a couple of miles from where their abduction occurred, there's a place called Horn Island. Horn Island, for years, was where some of the most highly classified research was undertaken into things like hallucinogenics and how the human mind could be manipulated. It was also at a place where a substance known as BZ, or buzz, was tested. And this is sort of one of the most graphically psychedelic, if you like, substances that can affect the human mind. And so when you realize that this was tested literally down the road, so to speak, from where the Pascagoula experiment, abduction, however you want to term it, occurred, you have to wonder, was there a tie-in there? Did they actually see a UFO? Were they manhandled aboard by strange aliens wearing what looked like as if they were in like a one-piece bodysuit? Or could it have been some sort of helicopter and they were taken on board by guys in hazmat suits, but in their sort of massively mind-altered state, they perceived it in some other fashion? Who knows?
Yeah. It's definitely, it seems like it gets harder and harder the further towards the presence that you get, or toward the present that you get, that it's harder and harder to separate what's military or experimental versus what's a genuine phenomenon. I mean, if you go back to the 1800s, well, we didn't have stuff flying around the sky, but now, it could be a drone, it could be an experimental craft, it could be just about anything, and they're obviously using it for their own means, using the phenomena for their own means as well.
Yeah, well, what I think is that there's two things going on. There's sort of our UFOs, and there's their UFOs. And by our, I'm talking about military agencies, private corporations, and their UFOs, I'm talking about the entities behind the phenomenon, whether they're extraterrestrial, whether they're interdimensional, whether there's some people even believe they're time travelers, or is it a combination of all those factors? But I think there are those two distinct categories. Now, one of the interesting theories, people say, well, why would agencies fake a UFO event? Why would they want to make somebody believe they'd seen a UFO? Why put them into this sort of psychedelic state? Why maybe have somebody like John Fuller, write a book promoting the UFO angle if he knew it was MK Ultra? One of the interesting theories that's been put forward for this is that, particularly in the late 40s and 50s, we know there was a great deal of concern on the part of government agencies as to how the public might react when faced with a UFO event. Well, if there's one thing you can say about UFO encounters, we're unable to predict when and where they're going to occur. So we're not able to target and watch the reaction and the response of the witnesses. Well, so if you want to know how people might react, both sort of locally or on a large scale, or even very intimately on a one-to-one level, and if you're not able to predict it, maybe the best way to understand and gauge the reaction is to fabricate an event and secretly watch the reaction of the witness that way. In other words, if you can't get to the heart of the phenomenon when it occurs and the person has interaction with it, do the next best thing, stage it, and see how they respond. Do they freak out? Do they have a nervous breakdown? And what's interesting is that the two guys in Pascagoula in '73, Charles Hickton was elevated by the experience. Calvin Parker, the guy with him, he had a complete nervous collapse. So if that was a staged event, that would actually tell whoever did the experiment, wow, if we place people into close encounter type situations, we can pretty much predict that 50% of the people are going to learn something from it or accept it and be excited. We could also be dealing with 50% of the population who are going to plunge into like a total psychotic state.
Yeah.
So that could have been one of the reasons. Set a situation up, watch the witness, see how they react. That'll give us a good indication of what would happen in the real world, so to speak.
All right, you're on WVBR FM Ithaca. This is Where Did the Road Go? The Last Exit for the Lost will be up in just a few minutes. I have a couple other things I wanted to ask you about. One of the things I wanted to ask you is how do you go about doing the research on this stuff?
Well, my background, when I finished school, I worked on a magazine called Zero, which is like a music, fashion, entertainment type magazine. And they sort of taught me all, various aspects of journalism and so on. And so I've always sort of applied the same techniques to investigating a UFO event or Bigfoot or whatever that I would use if I was just writing about a regular news story for a newspaper. In other words, you track down witnesses, you speak to them, you look for corroborating witnesses. I use the Freedom of Information Act to try and get, again, corroborative material like documents and files, and just try and put the full story together. Track down old-timers and, be persistent and knock on doors and let the phone ring out till somebody really does finally answer, and then you put it all together. So in other words, you have to be sort of proactive and persistent to get the answers. And sometimes, it can be exciting. Other times, particularly when you're stuck in government archives, it can be as dull as dishwater, until you actually stumble upon a really interesting document, if you do. There have been sometimes, for example, I've investigated a lot of cases where it's literally stalled, and I've not been able to really take it anywhere. It started off as a great story, but there were brick walls everywhere, everybody had died, and the best will in the world, I just could not get past that. So, I get that at times, that you just are not able to take it any further. But you just have to be, persistent. You have to use the same regular techniques that somebody would if they're writing about, a corrupt politician or somebody about a murder case for a newspaper. It's pretty much exactly the same techniques, even though the subject matter is very different.
And how tricky is it doing the Freedom of Information Act requests?
Well, actually, there are certain guidelines and rules you have to follow. I've actually had a lot of good experiences using the Freedom of Information Act, particularly with the FBI. They've always been really good at releasing their files. I know some researchers sort of roll their eyes and say, no, they don't release anything. But that's not true. You've just got to word it properly. For example, if you want to file a request for files on a particular individual, say somebody told you that Colonel John Smith, conducted an alien autopsy or whatever back in 1965, and you wanted to get hold of his files. Number one, you would have to provide evidence of death, like in an obituary. They won't just release, none of the agencies will release to you files on a person unless you can actually prove they're dead. Unless, of course, it's like a famous person like Frank Sinatra or Marilyn Monroe or whatever, when everybody knows they're dead. But in other words, you have to provide proof of death. You have to provide, if you can, like an obituary, even a social security number if you can find one somehow. But they're very consistent on that particular point. Also, if, say, for example, you were looking for files on Roswell, it's not enough to write to the CIA and say, please send me your Roswell files, because that means nothing. Roswell is a town in New Mexico. So arguably that could be the subject of your request. So, and even if you said a Roswell UFO crash, well, what if it actually wasn't a UFO? What if it was, say, some sort of secret airplane? Then, in other words, that would not flag any need for them to respond positively, because you've asked for UFO files. They're not obliged to say to you, well, we actually do have files on a classified aircraft that crashed, but you asked for UFO files, so we're responding literally to your request, that we do not have anything on a UFO crash. That is how the FOIA is interpreted. So you've got to be very, very, very careful as to how you word it. For example, if you were looking into a UFO event at a military base in 1953, you would say, I request access to files concerning an incident that occurred on the 9th of June, the 5th, 1953, at this particular airbase, involving this particular squadron, and I request access to the squadron logbook from that particular night, and that would probably be the best chance to find anything. It would be recorded, whoever's on duty at that time. So that's how you have to word it. But there are sort of 6 or 7 pieces of legislation in the Freedom of Information Act that allow for the continued withholding of files. People think it opens all doors. It actually doesn't. For example, there are still numerous files remaining classified from the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. For varying reasons, they still have an effect on national security. We don't know what those reasons are, but the files are still classified.
Huh. All right. One of the cases I wanted to ask you about too was the Betty Cash case, and I remember seeing this initially on Unsolved Mysteries back in probably the late '80s. And I want you to talk a little bit about that and then the possible connection to Rendlesham, which I found very interesting.
Well, this story goes back to December 1980 and sort of southeast Texas, and involved 3 people: Vicky Landrum, her grandson Colby, and a friend of Vicky's, a woman named Betty Cash. And people think of Texas as like desert and cactus. It's actually not. That's sort of Arizona and New Mexico. If you get past Dallas, where I live, and you head east and southeast, it's extremely heavily forested all around there, all the way to Louisiana, massively forested. And this particular event in December 1980 occurred near the town of Huffman, which is about a 45-minute drive from Houston, but when you get outside the outskirts of Houston, again, you're in like heavily wooded area. So that kind of sets the scene for where this event occurred late at night. And they were driving home, and they saw this strange light in the sky. It didn't have the regular lights that you would see in a normal aircraft, like, red, green, and white, and flashing and so on. Just seen a very bright, dazzling light and moving in an odd fashion. So they slowed down, and this thing came towards the road. Now, when I say road, we're not talking about like a 6-lane or 3-lane highway with cars coming back and forth. This is like a country road in the woods. And it was like a diamond shaped, and it came towards the ground. They stopped the car. They were terrified by whatever it was. They got out, and there was this intense heat. And of the 3, Betty Cash got closest to it. Well, as I said, they were terrified, so they raced back to the car. And by the time they got back to the car, the area had been heated so much that one of them had to literally use like the sleeve of the jacket to open the car door. They had to pull the sleeve down because it was so hot they couldn't open it with their bare skin. Managed to start the car up and just backed away quickly. Well, as they were backing away, they said that they saw what looked like a squadron of double-rotor military helicopters come into the area, as if they were either following the object or trying to capture it or shepherd it or possibly keep it from escaping. And over the years, this has given rise to two theories. Was it a UFO, a genuine UFO that was malfunctioning, or was it a test of some sort of highly classified device, possibly like a nuclear-powered aircraft that had gone out of control, and this was like a quick reaction team that was trying to secure and safeguard the area? We'll never really know, but what happened, the most disturbing thing, is that in the immediate days afterwards, all three, Betty, Vicky and Colby, fell sick. Nausea, dizziness, lightheadedness, throwing up, diarrhea, as if, something had affected them when they stood close to the craft. Betty Cash, who got closest to it, her hair literally started to fall out in clumps within days, and you can find photographs on the internet where she just got complete bald patches, like in a circular patch. She got very ill, and she actually developed breast cancer. Now, she didn't die for a long time afterwards, and although some researchers have suggested she had radiation poisoning, when you get radiation poisoning to the extent that your skin blisters and you're sick and your hair falls out, you pretty much have had a lethal dose and you would die very quickly. But she didn't die quickly. She died years later, but she did die of cancer, so there could have been a tie-in. And this has given rise that they may have been exposed to some sort of chemical, possibly via aerosol. Some chemical aerosols can actually mimic the initial symptoms of radiation poisoning, including nausea, dizziness, and hair loss. So I'm sort of more inclined to think that we're possibly dealing with a chemical element rather than literal radiation. But then again, if it was extraterrestrial, who knows what sort of radiation, may be different to what we experience normally on Earth. Now, you talked about the Rendlesham Forest case, which is without doubt Britain's most famous UFO event. Right. Occurred also in December 1980, over the nights of the 26th to the 28th of December. And bear in mind that the case in Texas was the 28th of December. So two events on the other side of the world, but there actually is a weird connection. The events in Rendlesham Forest were focused around two military bases, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. They were both owned by the British Royal Air Force, but one was leased out to a US Air Force presence. And the US Air Force base itself was actually home to a quick response team that when the Apollo moon missions were taking place, if, say, for example, the lander that came back, the module, I should say, that came back to the Earth from the moon, if it had landed off target somewhere in Europe or in the North Sea or the English Channel, this particular quick response unit based at Woodbridge, right outside Rendlesham Forest, would have been a helicopter-based group that would have gone out to retrieve the capsule and the astronauts. It turns out that the origins of that particular unit were in Houston, Texas, at the NASA Space Center. The NASA Space Center is only like 45 minutes from the town of Huffman, where Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum encountered this weird object. So this has actually given rise to an intriguing theory. What if the Rendlesham Forest craft was actually recovered and perhaps secretly quickly flown, because you described it as only a small object, and it could have been flown in a large aircraft or shipped across the ocean and made land somewhere near Texas, and was then sort of shepherded across the skies by this helicopter unit. Could it have been actually the very same craft, transported from the UK to the US? And then, unfortunately, it was seen by these people in this lonely country road late at night who were affected by it. So, very odd story. And again, like so many of these stories, I don't think we've sort of got the full picture just yet.
All right. Can you tell people about anything you got coming up as far as speaking engagements? I know you're going to be at Paradigm in October.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've got a couple of conferences I'll be speaking at. One is the annual Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which celebrates the sightings, of course, of Mothman. And that'll be on the 19th to the 21st of September. And I'll be speaking there on British reports of creatures like Mothman, which has actually surprised me, a lot of sort of flying humanoid-type creatures in the UK. And then I'll be speaking at the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis, which is on October the 2nd to the 5th. Then I'll also be speaking at the Texas Bigfoot Conference on the weekend of October the 18th to the 19th, on various research and investigations I've done into Bigfoot in Texas, in the sort of East Texas forests and so on.
Okay. And your next book?
Well, the next book coming out is it's called Chupacabra Road Trip, and it's all about the investigations I've done primarily in Puerto Rico, but also elsewhere, sort of on expeditions looking for the chupacabras, or trekking through the El Yunque rainforest, and interviewing people, and following up on cases, and it's sort of written, as you'll probably know from the title, but sort of written in like a road trip style of, just traveling around and just speaking to everybody and his brother, to try and get the lowdown on the chupacabra.
Any idea when that's coming out?
No, not really. It's I'm still in the final stages of putting the last touches to the book. It's still in the Word document form right now, but I would think round about towards the end of the year, I think.
Okay, all right. So the current book is Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History. And the compilation book of essays that you're involved in is Lost Secrets of the Gods, the latest evidence and revelations on ancient astronauts, precursor cultures, and secret societies. And they're both on New Page Books.
Correct, yeah.
And where can people find you online?
People find me at my blog, which is Nick Redfern Fortean, Fortean, nickredfern40.blogspot.com. Or type me into Facebook. There's a bunch of Nick Redferns, but I'm one of them. So just scroll down the list and you'll find me. And always pleased to chat with people. And everybody's got any questions or wants to share stories, always pleased to chat with them about that as well.
All right. And I do want you to talk about one more thing. And what we're going to end the show with is actually a song from our mutual friend, Micah Hanks. And he has written a song called Never Without You that is related to the Valentich. Valentich? How do you say his last name?
Yeah, Frederick Valentich.
Valentich, okay. His disappearance. So do you want to tell people a little bit about that, and then we can jump into Micah's song? Because this is also in your book.
Yes, well, Frederick Valentich was an Australian man, a young pilot who vanished under very weird circumstances in 1978. He was flying from Australia across the Bass Straits and reported to the ground personnel at the airport that he could see this weird configuration of lights that started to get closer to him, seemed to be almost playing like a cat and mouse game with him, toying with him, and he had no idea what it was. The ground personnel couldn't pick anything up on radar. Then he said it was hovering above him and then started to keep pace with him, and next thing that happened, there was this sort of strange grinding metallic sound coming through over the radio channels, and that was the last thing that was ever heard of Frederick Valentich. He was never heard of again. The plane was never found. Whatever this object was that closed in on him, that was never identified. And despite the fact that search parties, emergency services were sent up and ships were sent out almost immediately, nothing was ever found, so no oil slicks on the ocean, no wreckage floating, nothing at all. And I guess the only saving grace is that for the family, just a couple of years ago, the official files were declassified, and they run into hundreds of pages. And you can find them online, and it does show that the emergency services did a really good job of trying to find him, but there was just nothing. But the fact that it was, his disappearance, complete disappearance, an aircraft disappearance, was tied in with these weird lights, with this craft that he couldn't make out the proper shape of, and which he said was literally flying, keeping pace with him, so it looked like it was hovering over his plane. When you put all those components together, it's not surprising that it's sort of given rise to theories that maybe he was literally kidnapped by a UFO.
Yeah, and I think Micah said he wrote this song based on a conversation that Valentine had had with his wife, because he was interested in UFOs, and she said something like, would you ever go away on a UFO? And she said, never without you. Or he said, never without you, and that's what the song is called.
Yeah, that's very weird, because he did have an interest in UFOs, and you sometimes get that. It's like when people have an interest, it's like the phenomenon knows you've got an interest and then targets the person.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I highly recommend your book, and I thank you for spending some time with us. I did very I did very much enjoy reading it. It was, and like I said, you're able to bring up stories that I'm very familiar with, and put new information in there, and I love that.
Oh, well, thanks a lot.